welcome you all to the Canada Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Research Network's webinar, FASD and Aggression from Conceptualization to Clinical Best Practice. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jackie Pei. I am the Intervention Network Action Lead. I have to think what I am with the Canada FASD Research Network. I'm also a psychologist and the professor at the University of Alberta, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you to talk about this really important and significant topic in our lives. And I think everyone would agree, particularly judging from the group we have gathered. As we get started, before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm coming from as I speak to you all here and the lands that we all represent. An important step in Canada in reconciliation is the acknowledgement of traditional treaty lands and recognition for the people of the territory. The Canada FASD Research Network recognizes the historical significance and contributions of Indigenous peoples and their cultures, and understands the important role that the Indigenous community plays today and in the future. We acknowledge that we live, work, and meet on traditional territories across Canada of many of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. All right, let me introduce our amazing presenters and then turn it all over to the reason we're here today. Our first presenter will be Sarah. She is currently an undergraduate student studying to obtain her Bachelor's of Science in the Honours Psychology program at the University of Alberta. Sarah completed her honours thesis on strengths, resilience, and mental health in youth with prenatal alcohol exposure. Recently, Sarah has developed an interest in understanding how brain development influences developmental trajectories of various areas of functioning, including executive functions and emotional regulation in youth. Sarah believes that it is vital for clinicians and researchers to translate scientific knowledge into tangible strategies that young humans and their families find helpful. Our second presenter today will be Jessica. Jessica is a retired performer with a Master of Education and is currently a doctoral candidate in the School and Clinical Child Psychology program at the University of Alberta. Jessica's research is dedicated to better understanding and predicting aggressive and violent behavior, particularly among humans navigating neurodevelopmental difficulties, such as those with FASD and individuals deemed not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. Jessica is passionate about knowledge translation and sharing research. Maude, also recently dubbed Dr. Champagne, I had to throw it in Maude because that's such an accomplishment, but she's wanting to go by Maude, is an award-winning neuroscientist, social worker, and therapist who has received national recognition for her design, implementation, and evaluation of multiple programs supporting complex families. She's a highly sought-after bilingual trainer in the areas of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, attachment, trauma, and childhood aggression. Kristen Shepherd is a mother of six. That in itself requires all bold, all cap, and underline. 4 of whom were adopted from the foster care system. She's an adoption advocate and co-author of The Promise, Truth from the Trenches of Adoption, and currently working on a new book exploring the experience of parenting children with aggression. What a panel. I will now stop talking and turn everything over to this amazing panel who will get us going and take us through our presentation. Take it away, team. Sarah, over to you.
Now, before we go ahead and begin and really dive into the science behind aggressive behavior, evidence-based practices for responding to aggressive behavior, I just want to take a brief few moments to really define what it is that we mean when we refer to aggressive behavior. Here, we're defining aggressive behavior first and foremost as a vehicle for communication. That is the outward expression of a need, want, or experience that is directed from the individual outside into the world, into the environment, with the potential to cause harm. That is the potential for physical, verbal, mental, or emotional harm. Now here, I really highlight this essence of the potential to cause harm. Although sometimes we may conceptualize aggressive as intentional, wanting to hurt or harm. But there are a lot of times where aggressive behavior comes from a unthought out place that has the potential for harm where the intent was not so. There are also a variety of other labels that we often use to describe aggressive behavior, things like aggression or violence or externalizing behaviors. Today, we are going to be using aggressive behavior as an all-encompassing term to really describe all of these related constructs, but also to use aggressive behavior as opposed to a term like aggression or violence to separate the people from the problem. Aggression is not an identity. Aggressive behavior is a response. Which is a perfect way to segue into a brief disclaimer that we would really like to address before we proceed with the science and so forth. And that is, we by no means whatsoever want to equate FASD and aggressive behavior. These terms are in no way synonymous. Folks with and navigating FASD are not inherently aggressive. Aggressive behavior is not present for all folks at all times with FASD. Aggression is in fact not guaranteed in any of us, let alone any of us where there are sort of neurodevelopmental differences at play. Instead, I will transition to Sarah, who will talk about what our goals actually are.
So thank you, Jessica, for that disclaimer on what we're not here to talk about. And moving into what we are here to talk about today is instead the purpose of our presentation is we want to appreciate, recognize, and understand that there are overlapping vulnerabilities for aggressive behavior. And we want to explore what these vulnerabilities are and how they might be particularly salient for those with FASD. We want to equip ourselves to support and set up our environments to better interact with them to reduce the likelihood of aggressive behavior. And we also want to create a shared understanding of factors that fuel aggressive behavior so we can better respond when it surfaces. So there are a variety of factors at play predisposing us to a vulnerability for aggressive behavior. This includes brain factors, environmental factors, how these two interact, as well as emotional factors. And some of these factors are particularly salient for those with FASD. So there are a variety of brain-based mechanisms that underlie aggressive behavior. There are neurochemical factors involved, such as like neurotransmitters of dopamine and serotonin. There's also hormones involved. There's also brain structures and functions, including the hypothalamus and the HPA axis, which is involved in our stress response, and several other regions. But the two major areas I'm going to be talking about today are the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So the amygdala is a subcortical structure, which means it's buried deep in the brain. We can think of this structure as a neural watchdog. This is because the amygdala is our threat detection system. When it is active or online, it means the dog is barking and we are perceiving a threat. This is important because when our neural watchdog is barking, it can increase our likelihood of behaving aggressively in all of us. Then there's the prefrontal cortex. This is our brain's executive. It is involved in higher order functions like integrating information across our senses, decision-making, flexibility, regulating impulsive behaviors, to name a few things. In the context of threat detection, the prefrontal cortex, which is this kind of like front part of our brain in teal here, this can assess the threat that the amygdala has brought to our awareness and either tell the amygdala, calm down, or, oh no, you're right, that makes sense. So we're going to come back to these structures in a little bit. Next, I'm going to talk about some cognitive factors that in general elevate the likelihood of aggressive behavior in all of us. And we're going to talk about what the prefrontal cortex does in action. The prefrontal cortex is the house of executive functioning. Executive functioning is like our complex functions of evaluating, organizing, and planning to achieve our goals, which ultimately helps us navigate life successfully. This includes abilities such as problem solving, evaluating consequences, and thinking through alternative courses of action. A big piece of executive functioning is inhibitory control. Being able to pause and think before we act, to resist distractions and temptations, that's what we're talking about. And an example is when you're really trying to think hard not to call somebody a bad name after they've upset you or hurt you in some capacity, that takes a lot of effort, and that's what we're talking about with inhibitory control. So the prefrontal cortex is crucial for controlled, regulated responses. For some, difficulties with executive functioning means problems with problem solving, navigating alternative courses of action, which can lead us to acting without thinking, which is what we call impulsivity. When we have a tendency to act impulsively, it increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior as an impulsive response. Another example of an impulsive response is when other people are talking, sometimes we just get so excited and we want to jump in and we might interrupt people. So in general, challenges with executive functioning and impulsivity are implicated in aggressive behavior. What does this mean for FASD? These brain-based factors that I've talked about are implicated in aggressive behavior in all of us. When we think about alcohol, it's a teratogen. So what I'm talking about here is when the brain is prenatally exposed to alcohol, the toxic effects of alcohol can cause complications in the development of the embryo or fetus. Prenatal alcohol exposure impacts the healthy development of the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, those brain centers that are involved in aggressive behavior in all humans. The development of the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive functions and inhibiting our impulses, is negatively impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. What this translates to is that young people with FASD often experience notable difficulties with problem solving, planning, organizing, and evaluating consequences. That is, young people with FASD's brains develop in such a way that makes slowing down and thinking through consequences difficult. It also makes responding in an impulsive, aggressive way more likely. Together, this suggests a biological vulnerability towards aggressive behavior in individuals with FASD. Just going to take a quick sip of water. So next, I'd like to talk about some environmental factors. The research shows that there are notable environmental and social factors that make it more likely for anyone to engage in aggressive behavior. Things like low socioeconomic status, hostile, inconsistent parenting, family conflict, peer difficulties. So difficulty developing close connections with others can contribute to loneliness, developing maladaptive friendships. For example, if the peers we spend time with encourage us to respond aggressively, it increases our likelihood of engaging in aggressive behavior. Adverse childhood experiences. So, for example, growing up in a house with substance use problems or where we're witnessing violence in the house, this can undermine our sense of safety and can be potentially traumatic. If we've been exposed to these traumatic or adverse experiences when we grow up, we're learning that the world is threatening, and aggressive behavior helps us survive. Exposure to any, let alone a culmination of these factors, increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior. What could this mean for FASD? So I want to be very clear. Not every human with FASD has experienced these things. But what the research tells us is that folks with FASD, relative to the general population, have a higher likelihood of experiencing things like peer difficulties and adverse childhood experiences. That is, in addition to that biological foundation for aggressive behavior, some young people with FASD have a heightened risk of also experiencing environments that increase vulnerability towards aggressive behavior. So the previous brain and environmental factors I've talked about on their own increase one's vulnerability for aggressive behavior. But these factors also interact to further increase someone's vulnerability. Some of the primary ways the research suggests that brain and environmental factors intersect to produce aggressive behavior is through maladaptive social learning, difficulties with threat detection, and ineffective social information processing through misinterpreting social cues as hostile or aggressive. And this is known as the hostile attributional bias. So, for example, in a household environment, if every time an adult is angry, they start shouting, or conflict in the home is resolved through aggressive behavior, not only is the child exposed to that kind of behavior, but that behavior is being modeled and learned. The research shows that brain processes information similar to shouting, like a loud noise, as potentially threatening. Our amygdala, that neural watchdog, the threat detection center that I mentioned, will detect that as a threat, which triggers our stress response and big emotions. The research shows that when adults model those threatening behaviors, like shouting or throwing things, children learn and model that behavior going forward. If the neural watchdog is on alert and is sounding the alarm, our thoughtful, planned responses from the prefrontal cortex, such as like our inhibitory control and inhibiting those impulses, that's not online. Therefore, the environment and the brain factors are interacting to push somebody over the edge so that they may respond by shouting, throwing things, or even physically hitting or assaulting someone. What could this mean for FASD? So in general, for all of us, these interactions between brain and environmental factors can heighten our chances of behaving aggressively. For those with FASD, the combination of prenatal alcohol exposure and potentially risky postnatal environments often translates to major difficulties with correctly interpreting social cues, difficulties navigating and interpreting sensory input from the environment, so like a loud noise or bright lights, and an increased vulnerability for demonstrating learned maladaptive behavior. So together, further increasing the vulnerability for youth with FASD to demonstrate aggressive responses in our social environments. Moving on to emotional factors, research tells us that in general, emotions can propel us towards aggressive behavior. First of all, high emotions, big emotions, make us more likely to behave aggressively. So here I've included a GIF of the character Anger from the movie Inside Out. When he's lost it and he's taken control of the control panel, he's gonna do something. I mean, we've all been there. A universal experience for us is hunger. You know, we're hungry. We're angry that we're hungry. Stuff happens. I've slammed the door a little too hard when I'm hangry. You know, stuff happens. And I want to be clear that it's not only anger that leads us to behave aggressively. Big emotions like fear, feeling scared, certainly anger, but also positive emotions like joy, even surprise. Sometimes those big emotions, it can be really hard to interpret what they are in the moment. And we aren't really thinking things through carefully because that watchdog is online and our prefrontal cortex isn't. So, well, if we have a hard time understanding, identifying, interpreting, and regulating our own emotions, all those previous factors I've talked about that in everybody increase aggressive behavior, Emotions are now acting as the gatekeepers. So what do I mean by gatekeepers? Well, for everything I've talked about today, this comes back to our emotions are taking that prefrontal cortex offline. So how many of us have tried to access Google when the computer is not connected to the internet? I know I have, and that's a pretty frustrating experience. You'll keep clicking refresh, try to figure out how to make it work until you realize, oh, wait, I'm just not connected to the internet. The same thing happens with our brains when our amygdala is activated. That neural watchdog is very good at detecting threats, which takes our prefrontal cortex offline. So instead of being able to access the logical, rational, thinking things through part of the brain, we get cut off and we're no longer connected to the internet. This is actually why it's pretty impossible to talk to anyone when they're in this dysregulated state, because your body has triggered a stress response that cuts off your access to the internet, in this case, the prefrontal cortex. So we are more likely in this emotional state to be impulsive based on our emotions, and our prefrontal cortex is not thinking through those emotions. Also, emotions fuel our difficulties with sensory and social processing. For example, if I have so much fear in how other people are perceiving me, if I hear somebody laughing, I might think that they're laughing at me, and then I get upset and I might throw my pencil case. So what could this mean for FASD? In FASD, the research tells us that there is a predisposition to experience big emotions. That watchdog I mentioned earlier, for people with FASD, that watchdog is frequently on high alert, which means higher rates of those big emotions. Additionally, individuals with FASD tend to show difficulties with understanding, interpreting, and regulating their own emotions. Having those intense emotional experiences can predispose anyone to aggressive behavior. So it is not surprising why humans with FASD are really vulnerable here. So that was the background on some of the factors that increase anyone's vulnerability to behave aggressively. It is also important to consider all the factors I've discussed with you today are often happening simultaneously. To help make sense of the factors, I'm going to transition to Jessica, who will walk us through some of the models for disentangling, recognizing, and responding to these behaviors.
Hey, thank you so much, Sarah, for that transition and for really providing a deep and rich foundation on the science behind why aggression is occurring. So what I'd like to do now is to start trying to tie all of these pieces together, make sense of this information that Sarah has so articulately shared with us, and think about what this means as caregivers, as frontline workers, as nurses, as school professionals, what this means for our understanding and our responding to aggressive behavior. Now, this is important because when we think about responding to aggressive behavior, our main goal is to identify and respond to what it is that's causing or underlying or leading to that aggressive behavior. This is important because when we know what's underlying that response, that gives us a leg up and a benefit to be able to respond appropriately and leverage our responses in a way that can promote healthier, more adaptive responses in all of us. Now, in a brief few minutes, Kristen is going to take over and discuss a story of her lived and living experiences navigating a family of 6 kiddos, including navigating challenges of aggression and FASD in ways that I could not possibly begin to touch. For now, I'm just going to provide a brief example to walk us through this visual that I have in front of us to really capture what this means and how all of these factors kind of concurrently play out in the moment. To do so, I'm going to be using the example of Frank, an inspiration from a little man who I have had the pleasure of working with in the past. Now, Frank does not represent the experiences of all humans with FASD or places, all these places and places where this might occur, but rather just an example to work us through this model and work us through how to understand this science in actual practice. So let's take, for example, Frank. Frank has been diagnosed with FASD after prenatal exposure to alcohol in the womb. Now, from 0 to 6 years old, Frank was also raised in a rather chaotic environment where aggressive behavior was frequently used as a tool for communication, in particular, a tool for conflict resolution. Now, at 6 years old, because this environment was so chaotic, Mr. Frank was apprehended from this family. On a day where the police arrived with sirens blazing, an altercation between police and parents at the time unfolded, and Mr. Frank was brought into the police cruiser and brought to a foster family. Now let's fast forward a few years, where Frank has been living with his foster family for a good, let's say 8 or 9 years to this point, and living with this family who loves Frank with all of their hearts, is in the process of formally adopting Frank, and has really embraced Frank and included him as a member of their family, including both parents and 2 age-related siblings. Now, one day the family decides to go to an arcade. What a fun experience, we're all thinking, including Frank, who has been so excited and overjoyed at the idea of an arcade for weeks. When we get inside, the arcade is full of bright flashing lights, sounds, sirens as people are, winning the games that they're playing. And while inside, while all of these noises and sounds occurs, Frank and his 2 brothers decided to engage in a game of chase. And as they're running through, one sibling yells to another sibling, "Hey man, shut up." To respond, Frank acts what we might consider aggressive behavior towards the sibling yelling by addressing the sibling using a variety of profane names and threatening to kick their butts. To respond, a well-intended parent comes forward and mentions to Frank, "Hey buddy, we love our siblings. What are we doing? Can you please apologize to your brother? And if you can't, we're going to have to sit down and we are not going to be able to play here." To which Frank responds by punching the well-intended parent. Now, at first glance, I'm going to call our attention to the model in front of us. At first glance, in evaluating and thinking about Frank's behavior and aggressive responses in this arcade, we might be drawn to the 2 square boxes on the very outsides, left and right, of this model. First, we might be drawn to what I call antecedent box. For us nerdy folks, nerdy behaviorist folks, an antecedent. But what this translates to is a trigger. What triggered Frank in and amongst all of this? And at first glance, it might appear that nothing triggered Frank. We were come to the arcade, everything was fun, we were running around, and all of a sudden, yelled at his brother and punched his dad. Where we're really focusing on that left box, where our aggressive little man is showing that aggressive behavior. But when we're only evaluating this idea of what triggered him and what did that aggressive behavior look like, we are missing an opportunity to think about some of these underlying factors that are actually at play for Frank in all of those moments. Now, if we call attention to the circle on the left with the brain in the middle, and we reflect on those brain-based thinking cognitive factors that Sarah described earlier, we might recall that Frank's experience with FASD, Frank's development in vitro, his brain was developed in such a way that that neural watchdog, as Sarah so eloquently put it, is online. And that prefrontal cortex, that ability to think, to evaluate consequences, to plan appropriate behavior, has developed in such a way where, in general, that process of thinking and evaluating is difficult. Now, if we shift over to the right box where we've got kind of a social networking kind of looking logo here, this is our environmental factors. Now, as Sarah mentioned, environmental factors can on their own lead to aggressive behavior. For example, in this moment in the arcade for Frank, those sirens as somebody is having a great time winning bowling at the arcade are awful reminiscent of the day that the police pulled up at home. This idea that someone's yelling "shut up" in the middle of joy is also maybe reminiscent on some of those conflicting or, that conflicting language or aggression that he grew up exposed to. Pulling to that centerpiece there, we see the brain interacting with the environment. This means that instead of interpreting this as a fun game of chase with some silly banter, that Frank's brain interacts with his previous environmental experiences in such a way that he perceives the words "shut up" as a threat, that he perceives those lights and sirens as threatening. Now, this may lead to aggression on its own, but it might be further fueled by the experience of emotions. That last box there, as we can see, the emotional piece. As Sarah so eloquently described, if we think about emotions as kind of the Wi-Fi, in general, the feeling of joy, the feeling of anger or fear in the moment might lead to an aggressive response. But it also hampers the ability for that prefrontal cortex to think and evaluate through these consequences. So when we stop and we take a look at more of what's going on in that arcade, we evaluate how Frank's little brain has developed. We evaluate the sensitive experiences Frank has been exposed to and what that means for how the brain interprets the world around him and the emotions that he experiences. It better leverages us to think about responding. Next slide. Now, with regard to responding, in a few moments, Mode is going to take over and just really go through evidence-based practices for responding to aggressive behavior. And I'm going to lead the evidence and the responding to Mode. Right now, I just want to briefly think about how this shared understanding and this stepping back and evaluating the factors at play might actually impact how we're responding and implementing the incredible supports that Mode will share in a few moments. Now, to complicate things even further, in addition to Frank having all of these biological, psychological, social, environmental factors at play, so do us as caregivers, so do us as nurses, responders, frontline workers. Now, we've seen a portion of this model in our last slide together, the antecedents, the business in the middle, and the aggressive response. Here, what we've added is this sort of kind of pipe of us as caregivers, as responders on the way to that potentially aggressive or potentially adaptive response. That is on top, we see our perceptions and understanding of the world, including our perceptions and understanding of the world when we ourselves are in a moment of panic. Now, I'll remind us that aggressive behavior is scary. When we're responding to a kiddo who's aggressive, there is elements of fear and spike and shark water inside of all of us. And that's important to consider because it actually impacts not only the way we see the world around us, but it impacts the way that we are interpreting, for example, Frank at that arcade. And when we're interpreting Frank's behavior in a certain way, it then impacts the supports that we offer to Mr. Frank. So going back to Frank and this, sort of events, a course of events that happened in the arcade, if we're solely focusing on out of nowhere, Frank threatened and, aggressed towards his brothers and then hit, one of his parents, we're missing what's happening in the middle. That is our perceptions and our interpretation of that response is, hey, buddy, what's going on? We love our family members. Why are we out of nowhere acting aggressively? And the response we then offer, or that support we offer, is to ask Frank to kindly apologize to his siblings or kindly, calmly come sit down with us. When in reality, if we take a step back, if we zoom out a little bit and we think about all of the additional factors at play for Frank, in addition to just the moment of the aggressive behavior, it can better leverage us to provide more proactive responses. For example, If we look at Frank's behavior and we think about the emotionality piece, we think that those high emotions are present, that neural watchdog is live, and that prefrontal cortex is not online and not in a position to be able to talk through or evaluate the behavior at hand, that asking Frank to talk about it, that asking Frank to apologize to his siblings might not be the most beneficial way of responding. Instead, we might think, I see that the emotions are high here. I know that Mr. Frank has a difficult time accessing that prefrontal cortex and thinking through things when he's activated. I know that these sirens might be a little overwhelming and a lot for Frank. It allows us to interpret the behavior differently and provide a different type of support. For example, a support that addresses those emotions, a support that says, "Whew, guys, we're all getting a little bit up there right now. Why don't we all come sit down together, have a glass of water, regulate things a little, and then get back to playing." Or addressing, "Hey, I even feel a little overwhelmed in this moment with everything that's going on. Frank, I got to step away and step outside to give myself a break. Want to come with me?" Something to offer a support that is addressing some of the underlying unseen factors at play. Next slide. Ergo, the take-home messages, at least to this point in the presentation, from the underlying foundation that Sarah so brilliantly brought forward today, is first, aggressive behavior and the potential for aggressive behavior exists in all of us. This is not unique to FASD. We have all acted a little too aggressively, slammed that door a little too hard, yelled at family when we've stubbed our toe and it hurts. It happens. Now, unfortunately, as much as I would love it, there's no magic wand for being able to respond here. But instead, what I encourage us to do is to be able to think that there is a way of proactive responding. And that proactive responding looks like creating an approach where we're really stepping back and reinterpreting all of the factors at play, all of those underlying factors that may fuel that aggressive response. For Frank, and for all of us. Next slide. That is the major take-home recommendation that we have, is for all of us to stop, to slow down, to take some of our own deep breaths and to consider, what else is at play here? How do we best respond therein? Thank you once again for having us, for listening to these underlying mechanisms. I will now transition things to Maude, who is really going to dive into evidence-based practice for our responding. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jessica. So here comes the magic wand. No, I wish. But thank you. This is such important work to understand why this is actually happening. And I think it's very helpful sometimes in that intervention to know the reason behind the behaviors. However, the problem is sometimes we don't know. And even, by identifying triggers, by providing accommodations, there will be aggressive behaviors that stays. So this is kind of what I will talk about today based on my clinical practice and my research. And when I describe it, what I actually talk about, I usually use the metaphor of the tornado. So Sarah and Jessica said, aggressive behaviors are in all of us. So it's kind of like the wind, it's everywhere. But not everyone will display a tornado or experience a tornado in their family. And even within the same family, let's say I support families who have adopted multiple kids with FASD. One of them may display aggressive behaviors and the other one doesn't. And yet they're in the same environment. And sometimes they're even biologically related. So when you have a tornado, and when I say that, I'm not saying the child's a tornado, I'm saying you need some elements that they described in the individual that may form a tornado at some point. And when you have a tornado in your family, what it leads to is emotional, physical injury, siblings may be traumatized, parents are traumatized. It's also very dangerous for the person who displays these behaviors. And the idea is that we will support all family members to improve their quality of life beyond these behaviors.
But I used to be a clinician and not a researcher. And when I started researching the experience of families who have children with FASD, many of them said, you know what, I wanted to provide these children with peace, safety in my home, secure attachment, and then I wake up to a war zone. It's highly difficult to care for these children, and now there's aggression in my home, there's chaos. And that's exactly what they were not thinking they were signing up for. And they're amazing parents. So you do have the environmental piece where the parents are really well equipped, and yet there's still aggressive behaviors. Many of them said, you know what, anytime I go see a professional, they say, oh, your child's dysregulated. But honestly, as a clinician, when I hear dysregulation, I think, they're throwing their plates on the ground, like something, minor. But for many of these caregivers, there's such a severity in the kids' behavior that they fear for their own lives, and they fear for the child who has FASD and displays these behaviors. They fear for their lives as well. And sometimes it leads to adoption breakdown. It leads to severe trauma, severe physical injury. So we're not talking about like minor dysregulation here. We're talking about patterns of behaviors that are repetitive and that are actually compromising the safety of others and of themselves as well. And oh, you can switch to the next slide. So the next slide is actually really important because it's full of resources. When we started hearing that from families, we did this consortium with policymakers, people in academics, therapists, individuals, both caregivers and young people with the living and lived experience. Not all of them had FASD, but the majority of them had a diagnosis of FASD, several of autism, complex trauma, and they talked about their experiences. And a lot have said, we don't want to further stigmatize people with disabilities and saying that they are aggressive or violent. Many of them don't use aggressive behaviors, but this is actually happening. And we need to find a term that captures the severity of what's happening so we can address it and support all family members. So the National Consortium, like I said, it's not only on AFCA, but it's full of resources in English and French, many family stories, and evidence-based practice on how to support these families beyond very specific interventions. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So my whole thesis was on FASD and aggressive behaviors. If you want to learn more about my first paper, there's actually a presentation that I had done a few years ago. It's on the YouTube page at CanFASD. But this paper actually led me to want to further investigate how can we respond to aggressive behaviors when it's happening in families. And you know what? Many families said, I think my child has such complexity that I don't know that behaviors will change eventually. For some of them, it does, but for some, it's so complex, like the attachment, the trauma, the FASD, you name it, that the behaviors don't improve that much. So like, what do we do, right? And as a therapist, I'm also an adoptive parent, I thought, okay, we have to figure out something. So I found this intervention called Nonviolent Resistance. Sometimes we say NVR, not to be confused with nonviolent communication. They're two different ideas or approaches. And it was sponsored by Kids Brain Health Network, and we had a pilot study with individuals from the UK. Our participants were here in Canada. And you can switch to the next slide. And NVR now is being used at Interwoven Connection. You may know them as Adopt for Life. I worked there and we had several cohorts. So we have more data, but this is what I'm showing you today. There are case studies on NVR as an intervention for aggressive behavior and FASD. So why I chose NVR? NVR had been tested all over Europe and widely used for other mental health disorders like anxiety, eating disorders, as well as neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism. And the idea behind NVR is that we take care of the caregiver. Children don't grow up on rocks, you know, in isolation. So a lot of our interventions, sometimes they're quite child-focused, and we forget that they develop within the family setting. The caregivers are the ones doing the advocacy, the daily work, and the caregivers are the ones taking the blunt of the aggression quite frequently. And when we heard from caregivers, we heard that many of them felt the stigma of sharing the FASD diagnosis, but also sharing that aggression is happening in their home. Oftentimes they're being blamed. So it leads them to becoming more isolated, having less support. And it's very much a systemic issue. So, you know, like if your neighbor has a tornado destroying their house, you're not going to blame the neighbor. You're going to want to help. It's a community approach with NVR. You can go to the next slide. So I don't have a lot of time to explain what it is. If you go on the web, you may find a lot of things on NVR. It's also a sociopolitical approach. What we're doing at Interwoven Connection is adapted to FASD, but what you may find online may not be adapted. Okay, just as a disclaimer. So what we did is we had 12 weeks of intervention, 6 weeks of group sessions, and it was alternating with individual sessions. So, you know, giving the psychoeducational information and trying to, you know, implement it in your own home. There is some de-escalation and communication technique, increasing structure, but the main thing is to help families figuring out which behavior they will no longer accept. And even if the child with FASD says, well, I don't care if you don't accept it, you know, like maybe they're still going to be displaying these behaviors because it's beyond their control. We make sure that there's a supportive network around the family. And I think Kristen can probably explain more like what it looks like in practically. We are very focused on making sure all family members have what they need, and they need to recover from their trauma. Many families are bounced from one intervention to another or parenting courses, and we don't address the trauma that they have experienced. So it's kind of like, you know, the example that Jessica gave at the arcade, but it's like every time you go out, this is what happens. And you fear for your kids' lives, and you fear for your own safety and the embarrassment. And it's happening daily. That creates a lot of trauma in the parent. And it becomes really difficult to engage and be emotionally present with this child. Or it also sometimes it's becoming like unsafe. Like it's not just a perception that they have, it is unsafe. So to keep going, and then the next slide, Jessica. What we found, so we had 4 families going through NVR in this pilot, and we interviewed 4 parents, but in 2 families. And all of them said they had the better ability to self-regulate. So basically, like whenever there was an incident, it will kind of trigger their trauma, but they had tools to manage their trauma and their emotions. They were also more able to set boundaries and prioritize certain behaviors. So for example, every time you set a boundary and your child's acting aggressively towards siblings or yourself, like this is becoming really hard, right? To have some rules and boundaries. So they were more able to do that because they felt safer. We were able to have safety measures in place. They also talked about having a better circle of support. The younger children had some changes in behaviors, which is, NVR is not even about changing the child's behavior, but we saw some changes, especially in their ability to play alone, to not be as demanding. And my interpretation of that as a clinician, and I keep seeing that, is a lot of children and youth with FASD also have attachment disruption, and their perception of parental boundaries is negative. You know, when they were talking about hostile attribution, so as a mom, if I say, you cannot go see that friend at midnight because, you know, they're 20 years older than you, they may think, you know, you don't mean well. but to an extreme, right? And it accumulates over time. And this aspect is actually something that is worth investigating in terms of a possible intervention. How do you change that perception, those hostile attribution? And with NVR, it keeps that in mind. It's about the quality of life and the child to parent relationship. So we do try to work on those perceptions for both the parent and the young person who displays these behaviors. So next slide. So the takeaway, I didn't have that much time. I hope the takeaways are the resources I'm going to have on the next slide, but mainly a lot of caregivers feel like they're taken out of the equation. Like there's so much focus on the child. You need to have the child and parent perception to understand a situation as a clinician. And we need to validate the experience of all family members. Like when caregivers shared with me their experience, they say, you know, when I talk to professionals, they try to reassure me so much or minimize, and that's not really helpful. Like it goes a long way if you say, I believe you. And yes, it's awful. And that's what we need to do. That's the first step for them to be more regulated and feel like they can share what's actually really happening in their home, even if that's really, really hard. And again, what we try to do is improving the quality of life of all family members. Are there ways we can provide services to the siblings? Sometimes it's victim services, therapies, supporters around them. And the last one is rethinking what family looks like. When I adopted, I was also an attachment therapist. You know, the recommendation was like, you just stick to, you know, the two parents, one or two parents, and then you provide that attachment, you know, with this child. And increasingly, we're seeing with the level of complexity of some of these children, they actually need multiple caregivers. Sometimes it's not safe for them to live in a home environment, but we can still promote healthy and safe relationship with their parents, whatever it looks like. And we need to be creative in terms of housing, in terms of co-parenting these children. And there's different models that are starting, I think, to be created and not put all the burden, for the lack of a better word, on caregivers to maintain that relationship in their home without support when it's that unsafe. We're also, if you switch to that next slide, very quickly, if you have questions that are not answered here, please contact me and I'm happy to share the resources if needed. And the next slide is also 4 important resources. The Consortium on AFCA, there's the slide that I talked about, where it's funded by KBHN. We're doing a clinical manual on AFCA, and there's a specific section on FASD. If you want to be on the waiting list, feel free to send it. Interwoven Connection is in Ontario. It's used to be called Adopt for Life. We have a caregiver series on YouTube. It's free to access. Please go see. You'll see caregivers talking about their experiences. And a lot of NVR elements. So NVR is now in Canada. It's not adapted to FASD yet. It will be in the manual, but NVR Canada provides some trainings if you're interested. If you want to know more, you're not sure, please contact me. I'm happy to answer any question. Thank you. So I'll leave it to Kristen to talk about more of her experience as a caregiver. Thank you.
Thank you, Maude. I feel like saying Maude and I go way back because we have participated in the NVR. I saw someone put, what is NVR, Nonviolent Resistance? This is my fairly non-identifying slide, just to sort of kind of pop up pictures of our family here. And I should say all of my kids have always been on board with our honesty and sharing our experience as a family. I've done a lot of articles for Today's Parent, and as mentioned, wrote a book. they too, even at a young age, were concerned with issues within the system or support that they couldn't receive. And so we'd always talk, oh, let's help make the change, okay, guys? And so they've always been good with that. They are all young adults now. The youngest is turning 18. So now I have adult approval as well. But the date up there, February 18th, 2010, is when I legally adopted a sibling set of 4. We already had 2 biological children, as mentioned. And we'd already had them since the previous June. And they had an adoption disruption as well as a very difficult past. And so right off the get-go, we saw a lot of acting out behavior that, so many people experience when they first bring kids into the family. And at that time, our CAS hooked us up with a support worker who really helped me understand so much what was going on. I wish I'd had Jessica's presentation 14 years ago, because even now I'm like, oh yeah, okay, don't talk to them when that's happening. So when they're offline. But, I ended up writing a book with the support worker because we were able to work through so much early on. And at that time, we really had no diagnoses with the kids. And so much of it was attachment based, or their fear of losing a home, that anxiety. We wrote this book. It was very much to prevent an adoption breakdown. We, unfortunately, our children had experienced that already after 1.5 years in an adoptive home. So my goal was that would never happen again. And certainly wanted to help other families, not pull the plug too quickly. And years later, you learn a lot, and it's been quite a roller coaster. So I'm sort of going to share my experience with AFCA, the aggression towards family and caregivers in childhood and adolescence. When we adopted the kids, we did not have any diagnoses for them. And it turns out all 4 were very significantly impacted by a lot of drug and alcohol use in utero. And after they were placed with us, we did pursue more diagnoses, and 2 were diagnosed with FASD, our oldest son of the adopted children and our youngest daughter. So we sort of have best and worst case scenarios. And I like to give the best case as well, because I don't want to share these stories and have everybody who has a 4-year-old maybe in the home freak out that this is going to be their story, because there really is such variability. And even within kids, it can change year by year. So, we went through so much. I do know myself and so many parents, they're sort of told, well, you just need to put some boundaries in for the kids, or, modify their behavior in some way. And that is very difficult with FASD kids. They lose the skill, even if you could kind of teach it. We had a lot of aggression with our eldest son, and we really did move through that. He really did get the skills he needed to regulate himself. And he was actually 10 when the adoption happened. And he made those changes. You would never know that he was, was part of AFCA, basically. I'm not sure, I don't want to call him an AFCA child, but was part of that. A lot of real room destruction, physical violence, running away, and kind of holding the family hostage that way. You do what he says or something's going to happen. So we had another mental health crisis. He really did come out of that, learn those skills. We had a big crisis right around the time high school left, or he left high school. But we managed to pull in some great support for him. We were hooked up with community living. We had an employment facilitator. There were other people to sort of kind of wrap around me and help get him to appointments and whatnot. And he is now 24, very happy, very productive, has his first girlfriend, works. And I really consider that sort of kind of a best case scenario, because we were told this was not possible. He would never live independently. I had a really well-meaning, wonderful special ed teacher say he was the most difficult kid she'd worked with in 30 years. And, you know, sort of we had to offload him as quick as we could because there was really no hope for him. And luckily we didn't listen, because we stuck it out, and he has turned out fantastic. And so just to give you that hope before we dive into what happened with our youngest daughter, she also 4 years old, 3 years old, actually, 4 years old around the adoption, and really, really aggressive behavior from day one. But it was so hard to understand what was developmental trauma, what was mental health, what was attachment. And there is sort of a minimizing that's done of it when your child's only 6 or only 7. They're destroying a room, you pick them up, off we go. Very different when they hit 16 and that behavior is still present. So we did face a huge amount of issues within the school, right from early on. Even her adopted siblings, let alone her biological siblings, really struggled with that relationship, because she could pretty much blow up any situation. By age 7, I think 7 or 8, our pediatrician recommended she be put on medication. And I remember asking the doctor, like, well, what are the long-term consequences of putting a child on medication at the age of 7? And she said, we don't know. But I do know what the consequences are of her having absolutely no relationships. So that sold me. We did make the difficult decision, and it did help somewhat, especially with regulating that rage. Not necessarily the huge ups and downs, but the rage. But unfortunately, it never fully went away. And once we hit high school, that's when things really became unmanageable. And they were always difficult. I don't think we'd slept for 14 years, basically. That child could not sleep, which I only recently learned is quite common with kids with FASD. So that was never, ever addressed, other than getting, a little bit of counseling to talk about the spiders in the belly. But, alarms didn't work. She could deactivate. So you were always heightened and ready to go for years. But by high school, she really went off the rails, and we had great staff. It was a small high school, but they simply could not manage her. So we had endless suspensions, drug use started, and then very, very aggressive behavior, both within the family and without. And I appreciate Maude calling it, that tornado in the family, because, it could be still, you think it's fine, and then in a moment, rooms destroyed, stealing a car, chasing people with knives, shoving and punching and screaming for hours. She could scream. And there's really a sense of the family being held hostage by that, because you start making choices. Again, we can say, well, put some boundaries in, but all the kids that had boundaries was not effective for her. And you had to decide moment by moment, is this the day we're going to really confront her about this behavior? I remember we're selling a house. We've got people coming in 15 minutes. Is this going to be the moment? Because she would destroy the place, and she did prior to people showing up. So NVR was helpful. I'm going to get to that. But it did get to the point where it was so highly unsafe for her to be with us, for us, and for her. When she was dysregulated, I'm going to use that term, even though it's not throwing a plate on the floor, as Maude said, her steering the car off the road, grabbing the wheel and trying to drive us into a ditch when she's upset, chasing me with a knife. Those are the types of things that would happen. She eventually wanted to be removed. We called the police on one occasion, and she actually tried to make a drug deal with them so that they would remove her. She knew she was going to hurt us. And really, she was no longer safe, because at that point, I mean, she's going to be arrested for something, right? And we had very big concerns she was going to seriously hurt us and then have to take the consequences for that. So at one point, she did end up back in care. The very thing that we had always said we would never do and advocated for other people to not do. But that seemed to be the only option, according to everybody that was sort of in the know around us, that perhaps they would have access to residential treatment that we could not seem to access. That's got about a 2-year wait list for most parents, that they could perhaps, help with drug addiction, through treatment programs, whatever. And if nothing else, she would be in a place of safety and we would be. It unfortunately did not turn out that way. She was 16, so she had to be independent, which she was not capable of because of developmental delays. And this is what we learned during that time, especially by 16. There's some strange gap that between 16 and 18 that these kids can fall into, where the things that would support children are not there, but the things that support adults are not there. We had a terrible time trying to find anybody to help her with addiction, because between 16 and 18, nobody seemed to want to touch that. We talk about sort of the mental health system. She has still never had a psychiatrist. We had one option, and he said if there's any substance abuse of any kind, including marijuana, he will not see her. So she has never had a psychiatrist. We have been in and out of hospital with multiple suicide attempts, often used sort of in an AFCA way as a way to control the family. But they were significant attempts, and we were in and out of hospital, very hard to get any kind of treatment. She spent so much time in restraints. On one occasion, 19 hours, shackled by her arms, her legs, her pelvis, her head. But what we always thought, okay, we're going to get help at this point. We're going to get help. And it never showed up. The last time we went, I spent 3 days locked in a room with her in an ER, because they promised us there would be a bed up on unit and she could receive treatment. And she did. It was worth that 3 days, even though I couldn't sleep or eat for 3 days. It was, a form of torture in a way in an ER. It's just, I hats off to the doctors and nurses who spend, 8 or 9 hours there. It was unbearable. But she got a bed on unit. I think this is going to help. Within 6 days, I'm told to pick her up. No doctor speaks to me, and she's, back with us. And that carried on. And I'd been friends, with the director of Interwoven Connections / Adopt for Life for many years. And she's like, why have you not been getting help from us? And so I did. And I benefited from Maude and some of the other people doing polyvagal theory to learn to regulate your nervous system, because we had serious trauma. So many of the parents, that I speak to are like me, where just your phone ringing, what that can do to you, because it's the police, it's going to be the hospital, something terrible is going to happen. And we then did the NVR, the Nonviolent Resistance, and we were able to really start setting down some boundaries, but specific ones that were what we felt was the right thing. And we narrowed it down to like 3 things. My husband has a PhD. He loves education, but that could not be what we were going to push. And other people are going, why are you letting your kid get out of going to school? I would never do that. But that was not in our basket. There was no abuse in the home. There was no drug use in the home. We could narrow it down to these 3 things, which then empowered us. And we were part of a great community as well. I can't say enough about the people there. There was a support. And I wish we had had it when they were younger. And I think that's so much of what I'd like to communicate, is that a lot of interventions are not offered when they maybe could be most effective. NVR, I wish I'd had when she was 4, when she was 5. Trying to do this at 17, it was a very, very different situation for us, but still effective. And, you know, I think back to, you know, one of the elements of NVR is that support and having, you know, maybe people come into the house, because sometimes these kids will downregulate a bit, especially if it's a stranger. And I do recall neighbors stopping by when she was young and having massive tantrums, and how that did help. Unfortunately, we really didn't have that at this late in the game. Parents with very aggressive kids tend to lose a lot of the people in their lives. So many people just could not stand watching what was happening to us anymore. And they sure don't want to visit. And so that became a real difficult thing, because we couldn't even put into practice a few of the things that you would use with NVR. One thing we finally did get to utilize, she did get to go into a residential treatment program and still spend a significant amount of time at home. I think this past March, she was with us for half the month, but she was able to start, you know, she got back on her medication properly, the drug use was gone, and very much part of the family again, because she had lost pretty much everybody in her life, including friends. One of the reasons also that we needed NVR, the support of interwoven connections and whatnot, is because you do lose your support system, and people really don't understand why you're not just kicking the kid out. Especially for me, you know, we're Gen X, you listen to your parents, it's their way or the highway. But our kids with FASD, you know, they have developmental delays. Our daughter is very tiny. You know, she might look like she's 10 or 11. Are you going to put someone who looks like they're 11 out on the street with no friends? You know, she wasn't the street-wise kid with 10 friends she could go crash on their couch. She really had nowhere to go. So treatment has been absolutely fantastic for her. The staff managed to make great relationships with her, and has been a very positive experience. So I would not still say we are out of the water. Unfortunately, she did start sliding backwards again recently. I think she would have benefited from continuing on with school, but they let school out in June, even for the kids in the treatment program. And she felt she was done. So she started backsliding, unfortunately. And then she was asked to leave the program. So we are right now currently scrambling to figure out what we are going to do in terms of, you know, finances for her, where she's going to live, and how we're going to move forward. The system really has not particularly supported her journey through the years in so many ways. There have been, you know, our CSCN, we have a special FASD coordinator there, our wraparound coordinator, interwoven connections. We had a great pediatrician. We have been very lucky, probably luckier than most people, to have that kind of support, and yet we still couldn't seem to get exactly what she needed. But I am optimistic. I hope that NVR is going to be available for so many more families, particularly the young families, young kids. So I think that's probably everything I need to say. Support is huge. Support workers, when you are 24 hours a day in it, and so many of the parents I've spoken to for my next book, they have multiple kids. I know of one person who has 3 children that are displaying AFCA all at once. And, you know, that is a really, really difficult journey. And it's all night and it's all day, and you don't go away from it. You can't leave the house. Even with teenagers, you need someone there guarding things. Everything's locked up. And if you leave, that phone is on, and you're always being sucked back into the tornado. That tornado is, as Maud said. So yeah, I don't know what else to say, but thank you for letting me share my story and try to advocate so that so many people can hear what's going on. My story is not unique in any way, and in many ways, it's probably been easier than for many other families.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much, Kristen. And of course, thank you to all of the presenters. It really is an exciting opportunity when we can tackle a topic, and particularly a topic that's as important as this one, in such breadth as we did today. I mean, we essentially went from what we kind of refer to as the benches to the trenches. What is it like from the science world to what does it mean to have to shift our thinking and the way we're interpreting and understanding, to what it might mean in terms of treatment responses and some approaches that are super promising, to real world impacts and day-to-day life. And I think when we can look at challenges we face with such breadth, we embrace the fact that we can pull together as a team and continue to generate responses, wrap around families, and maybe challenge those systematic barriers that Kristen has described so beautifully in terms of success is possible and positive outcomes are out there. But until our systems wrap around families with a genuine understanding of the complexity and the brain-based origin of some of these challenges, we're not going to be able to really pull together. And I feel that this group, this panel, has really elevated the storyline and brought it home on all of these different levels. So I want to say thank you very much for doing that. If you've enjoyed the content and would like to access even more research and resources, consider becoming a CanFASD member. To get more information on CanFASD, to stay in the know with respect to all the upcoming webinars, please check out our website at www.canfast, that's CanFASD.ca, or follow us on our social media channels to find our resources. Otherwise, this material will be available to folks, so you're welcome to take a look, and that might provide an opportunity for some follow-up questions. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a fabulous rest of your Friday and enjoy some time to rest and relax over the weekend. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.